Agenda 21 is the United Nations 100-year-long master plan for humanity, the agenda for the 21st century. And this 100-year-long agenda is then broken down into shorter 15-year-long plans. The first 15-year plan was called Agenda 2015, or the Millennium Development Goals. And then currently, right now, we are living in the second 15-year plan of Agenda 21, the so-called Agenda 2030, which, according to UN documents, is the agenda to, quote, transform our world for sustainable development. Now, for the past 10 or so odd years, this broad agenda from the United Nations has been trickling down and getting implemented as concrete policies in countries around the whole world. Because what happens is that you have these different organizations, these environmental groups, and these different coalitions. They all go back to their respective countries, and in order to save the planet, they take advantage of the unique political and the unique legal situation in their home countries to get Agenda 2030 implemented at the local level. And so, for instance, right here in America, one of the biggest manifestations of this United Nations Agenda 2030 is the Biden administration's corollary Agenda 30 by 30. This is a plan by the U.S. government to take 30% of America's land completely out of production by the year 2030. This would mean that 30% of the land in this country will be placed into federal conservation, and it would essentially be idled. There will be no grazing, no farming, no drilling, no fishing, no developing, basically just no human activity at all. And while the current aim is to take 30% of America's land by the year 2030, once that's actually achieved, the next step will be to take 50% of America's land by the year 2050, the 50 by 50 plan. It's sort of a rolling project with the ultimate goal being for the federal government to own the majority of the land in America and to make that land inaccessible to the people in order to, of course, save the planet. Now, the U.S. federal government is achieving Agenda 30 by 30 in a myriad of different ways. They use the Endangered Species Act. They use the Waters of the U.S. Act. They have the president invoke the Antiquities Act in order to establish national monuments. They use federal money to convince private landowners to put conservation easements on their land. And so while it's technically still private land, you're not allowed to develop it. And then, besides all these different methods, well, there's now a new approach that the federal government is taking in order to push this agenda through. Hidden behind even a year of bureaucratic red tape, the BLM, which is the Bureau of Land Management, they are pushing through a backdoor rules change which would effectively sell out our public land to the highest bidder in order to achieve the goals of the 30 by 30 agenda. Essentially, they are working to create a system wherein these extremely well-funded environmental groups will be able to come in and purchase what would be called conservation leases on otherwise public land. And in so doing, these different environmental groups will be able to restrict all other uses on that so-called public land, meaning that there will be no more recreation, no more mining, grazing, fishing, hunting, or anything of that sort. And so, in order to make sense of how the federal government is going about this, while I was down in Texas, I took the opportunity to sit down and speak with Ms. Simone Griffin. She is the policy director over at an organization called the Blue Ribbon Coalition, which aims to fight back against these different federal land grabs. And she broke down for us exactly what's happening, what it means for the common citizens of this country like you and I, as well as what can actually be done about it. And so, take a super quick moment to smash those like and subscribe buttons and take a listen. Simone, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, this is the Stop 30 by 30 Summit. And we were talking, last night, and one of the things I realized after speaking with you is that it's not just about taking the physical land, right? It's sometimes about controlling what you can and cannot do on land that the government doesn't necessarily own, but they control. So can you discuss, tell the audience about some of the attacks on grazing that public lands are facing?
Yeah, and we're facing a lot of attacks. So in the West, there's a lot of public lands, whether it's managed by the National Park Service, the Forest Service, BLM, and through the Taylor Grazing Act, grazing allotments have been issued on these public lands. And so even though the BLM, for example, the Bureau of Land Management, they are mandated to manage these lands for multiple use and to allow these allotments, and these grazing allotments, they're private property. I mean, even though they don't own the actual land, they do own the allotment, and they've purchased it, so it is a private property right that they have to graze on their allotments. And what we're seeing is these land agencies, they're enacting policies and management decisions that are greatly going to reduce and have reduced grazing and access on public lands. For example, Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument was designated over 20 years ago, but we've seen the reductions through that management decision of cattle and sheep grazing over the years. Just right now, actually, they're undergoing NEPA process to reevaluate the management plan. And essentially, we're going to see lots of proposals within this management plan that are going to reduce grazing and the allotments. So they're proposing to cut the area, and it's 1.9 million acres, just this one national monument. And they're proposing to cut the acres available for grazing in half, and the AUMs, basically the amount of cattle that's allowed to be on each allotment, they're going to cut that in half. So these ranchers that have been there for 8, 9 generations, it's their history, it's their family culture, that's just getting slashed from out from underneath them, and it's hurting our economy, it's hurting education. I mean, it's such a ripple effect of how it affects these small communities. And that's just one plan and one national monument. And we're seeing more national monuments designated. We're seeing management plans all over the Western United States that are hurting these ranchers that have been doing it and have been the true stewards of the land for generations.
Now, the story gets a lot deeper, but